Welcome back to Indus Special. Now, while green politics gains more attention and citizens in developed countries continue to work towards protecting their environment, the situation becomes extremely ironic when tons of garbage from these very nations is dumped in Asian countries. But Asian countries are now pushing back. With this backdrop, tensions have escalated between Canada and the Philippines on the issue of returning 69 containers of garbage back to Canada, which was sent to the Philippines. Malaysia also plans to send back 3,300 tons of contaminated trash back to the countries it came from, which includes the US, UK, Australia, and Canada, and others. Let's explore this global garbage crisis in greater detail and what exactly has changed recently to bring about such a reaction from Asia. Let's discuss this story in further detail. We're joined by Mr. Uli Brickner, who is an analyst joining us from Berlin. We're also joined by Mr. Andrew Luing, who is an analyst joining us from Hong Kong. Thank you both for joining us. Mr. Uli, let me begin with you. We're seeing a momentum of green politics being built up in developed nations. But with that, we're also seeing more and more dumping of these countries' garbage on South Asian countries, the more poor countries. What do you think is happening here?
Well, in general, we see since the 1950s a massive increase of the production of specifically plastic waste. And this used to be uncontrolled and led to a point where maybe a year or two ago, it caught public attention in Europe that the oceans are massively polluted and we have to fear for the future of our planet, or at least the living conditions of human beings. And that reached the democratic debate, and international organizations like the Basel Convention have been established to discuss what can be done on a global level to ban uncontrolled transport of garbage that pollute the whole planet.
Right. But this trend of exporting garbage, what do you think is behind that? What system is in place to do this? Is it because developed nations cannot process their own waste?
Well, it seems as if the type of waste is the problem. We are pretty good in recycling glass. We are pretty good in recycling paper. But the recycling of plastic and other forms of toxic waste and electronic waste is still far from ideal. And so there are some incentives to externalize the problem and sign deals with countries like with China in the past. And once China realized that this is very bad for the Chinese environment, it turned into something like an unregulated system in which East Asian countries have been involved that makes it very bad for those countries and for the environment as such.
Right. And you're saying now there's great unregulation ever since 2018 and China banned taking in this waste. Have countries that were previously exporting their waste to China, have they come up with solutions internally in order to deal with this problem?
Well, recently Norway initiated a general ban of unsorted waste, and Germany, given the pressure of a more green-minded public, joined the initiative, and we saw negotiations of 186 countries under the Basel Convention. But as always with international organizations, there are loopholes in the system. There's a problem of control. And most importantly, the United States, as the biggest polluter, is not part of the system.
Right. And that does definitely show a huge problem in the system when the United States, who has one of the largest productions of plastics, does not want to be involved in any conventions or treaties which are aimed to reducing this issue. So do you think that there is a major problem at the global front of solving environmental issues?
Well, it's not only a major problem on the global front for this issue. We see a shrinking acceptance of multilateral solutions and the use of diplomacy and self-binding commitments of countries. While without any system of global governance, we will not face the challenges of the 21st century. And this is only one very pressing one.
Right. And with that, I'd like to ask Mr. Andrew, when we're talking about this situation here, one thing that is, of course, being highlighted is that this has been exacerbated ever since in 2018, China banned allowing waste coming in. give us a sense of how important the Chinese role was in recycling plastic and taking in the load of the global plastic waste.
Well, it's not just plastic waste, it's the dumping of waste all around, and household waste, which is a huge problem. But then China, of course, is changing quite rapidly. Previously, don't forget, apart from this dumping of waste, China accepted a lot of polluting industries, as indeed a lot of developing countries accepting the investments in polluting industries which have been outsourced from advanced countries. So the advanced countries escape the environmental consequences of this low-value kind of production, which has been outsourced to developing countries, starting with China, and now is moving to other countries. So that's the background. But as China's economy is developed, as China's environmental standards have been strengthened because there's a backlash of the middle class against all this pollution, and also other developing countries are facing the same problem. So this brings out the problem, the question of fairness. I mean, is it fair to outsource all this polluting kind of garbage to other countries, whereas the advanced countries are in a better position to introduce a system, how to reprocess this waste, how to make the disposal sustainable, and in fact, waste can turn into energy.
Right.
So
And Mr. You've highlighted a very important point there, the question of fairness. And that's one question I'm going to put to Mr. Uli before we let you go. How does the concept of fairness play out in what's happening?
Well, in general, when we speak of balancing the costs and the benefits of a system, it's always the best way of developing a level of governance in which you can negotiate and compensate those who are taking the burden. And especially since we only have one planet, but we act as if we have several, we have to find global solutions and don't leave it to a sheer system of power play in which the winner takes it all, or those who can enforce policies on others can just do what they want because they are powerful. This is not a system that would allow us to survive as the human species on this planet.
Definitely, and that's a very strong point you make there. Thank you so much, Uli Bruckner, for joining us and taking out the time to talk to us. Mr. Andrew, let's continue our discussion here. So we heard about the fact that this is no sustainable system for the future, and it isn't even now. South Asian countries are seeming to push back on what was being imposed on them. How well do you think that is going?
Well, I think that environmental consciousness is spreading all around, not only in advanced countries, but in middle-income countries, developing countries. I think citizens nowadays cannot accept this kind of cost in sort of polluting the environment, polluting their livelihood, the fields, then they grow their crops, the water resources. So I think that there is a backlash against this indiscriminate dumping. But I think the solution is also, if you look at the new energies, renewable energies, one source of renewable energy is the turning waste into energy. It's called the treatment of waste can produce energy. But then the technology, the investment that need to come with the initiator of this garbage. For example, if an advanced country want to export this garbage to the developing country, then advanced countries need to come up with the investment and also with the kind of technology and how to grow the kind of recycling energy in that developing country. But just exporting this garbage in exchange for cash is really outsourcing this problem to developing countries. And herein lies the question of fairness.
Right. And that's a very interesting to make there about the development of infrastructure within their own home countries, because just on May 10th, there was a convention that was being held in Geneva. 180 countries were a part of it. They were a part of the discussions regarding what to do with this waste. The United States came up with this statement, this suggestion that investment should be made in developing countries to help them process how they should deal with this waste. What do you have to say about that suggestion?
Well, I think that is actually spot on, as I said. Waste, if we just dump it into somewhere and then without producing the kind of benefits, is really that's not the way to do a sustainable way to address the problem, because a lot of waste can be recycled into energy, and also how to inculcate the population to develop a kind of the system as well as the behavior, and how to minimize the waste, how to segregate the waste into different categories so that they can be easier to recycle. So I think that, and also it's not just solid waste, it's also liquid waste, it's also a kind of sewage, and then allowing the how to contain the waste so that they don't spread into the water streams, they don't spread into the sea or the bay. So it's a huge agenda. And then the West, the developed countries have lots of technologies and, of course, lots of investment. And there's not just the investment is not just throwing money at it. In fact, it could be profitable. So it could be a profitable investment opportunity, both for the advanced countries and the developing countries as well.
Right. You're showing the economic side to it, but I do want to probe into that a little more. And for that, we're joined by Mr. Devinder Sharma, who's an economist joining us from Chandigarh. Thank you so much, Mr. Sharma, for joining us. Now, when China decided in 2018 to to disallow any waste coming into their territory, it upset a $200 billion global economic system that was based on recycling this waste. Tell us about the economics behind this, about recycling waste, about dumping waste onto other countries. How much money is earned? Who are the main players in this situation?
Well, I think you are very, very right. There has been a tendency over the years, in fact, over the decades, to send all the shipment, all the waste into developing countries, and in the name of economic development, and recycling of this waste was a huge industry. I remember some decades back, I had myself reported the Americans would not allow the recycling of the PET bottles, which you use when you drink, and they would be shipped all the way to India, recycled here, and then go back to America. Now, I thought that was atrocious. Now, I'm glad India doesn't allow it anymore, but India has now recently, after the ban in China, has also imposed a ban on the solid waste recycling or imports. And that, I think, is a very commendable step. Let's forget about the billions of dollars that go into this industry, recycling. I think what we need to cater to is how it impacts the environment as well as the human health. And all that, I find mischievous is that the developed countries who, if they are so sure that it's good for recycling and it's such a good product and it's a good industry, it helps everyone, then why don't they do it themselves?
Right.
That's the question. Why should Germany be sending all its waste to developing countries and not allowing the waste recycling within its own country?
Right. So, right. But Mr. Sharma, the question that could be posed from their side is that these developing countries are taking money for recycling this. So they are benefiting in some way, whether it is through money or economics. What can you tell us about that situation? What can you tell us about the economics behind this?
There is no denying that there's a huge lobby which goes to support this kind of initiative. They take money, they take technology also, and then they say that we are recycling and this provides employment. In fact, the bigger factor here is the employment it generates. But look at the shipbreaking, for instance, is a huge industry in India. All the ships which are not allowed to be broken in the other developed countries come to India, and we say it provides huge employment. I think this is atrocious. Why do we kill people, our own people, destroy our own environment just because somebody is making money? I think this kind of economics has to be discontinued. There's no way developing countries should allow this. I'm so happy China banned the imports of 24 hazardous waste into the country, and I'm so happy that India has done it. And I hope Malaysia, Indonesia, and the rest of the countries of Southeast Asia will also take the same steps.
And Mr. Sharma, it does seem that Malaysia and countries like the Philippines are trying to push back, and they're going to move towards at least creating a very very strong action against this, because that's what the politics says today. But more on that, Mr. Andrew, while we're seeing a situation, this diplomatic situation unfold between the Philippines and Canada and Malaysia, sending 3,300 tons of waste back to the UK, US, Canada, Germany, Australia. Do you think this is highlighting the hypocrisy of the developed nations? And do you think people within their borders are realizing the mess that they have been making externally?
As I highlighted earlier, there is actually a much greater awareness amongst the developing countries. I think that the situation is now becoming the problem is becoming global, because it's not just about money. It's not just about an industry, a kind of industry, a recycling industry. It's about the environment. It's about sustainable development. And I think that because many developing countries are facing the same problem, as indeed where with urbanization, there's more waste generated. And so it's a global problem that is ripe for discussion at the United Nations under the United Nations Development Program Sustainable Development Goals. And I think that both developing countries and developed countries can sit together to work out a solution which is fair and which is sustainable. On the one hand, how to minimize the waste, how to manage this waste, even within the developed countries themselves, but also if they were to ask the developing countries to help, then the developing countries should be assisted in terms of technology and investment.
But Mr. Andrew, it seems like when conventions take place, whenever there is discussion about a global conclusion of sorts regarding the issue or a global step to take, it never really matters, because it's all a talk at the end of the day, and it's business as usual once all the delegations leave the convention and they go back to their home countries. How can progress ever be made with that?
Well, I think that the situation is coming to a crunch. If China is refusing to accept this garbage just like that, and also the more and more developing countries like the Philippines and others are refusing to do the same, and then the advanced countries can't ship back all this garbage home without creating a lot of problems. So I think the pressure will be building up for this issue to be addressed at the United Nations, and solutions worked out to the satisfaction of both sides, and also amenable to the attainment of sustainable development goals under the United Nations.
Right. And on that, Mr. Sharma, the World Bank has projected that by 30 years, 70% of the garbage that we see today 100% of the garbage we see today will increase by 70%. With that, there will be a need for more infrastructure to process this. There will be more measures needed to be taken by all countries. How much do you think of an economic burden will that be on the economy? And do you think every country can dedicate that amount?
Well, I think let's be very positive on this point, that what the United Nations says or the World Bank says is basically to try to build up a kind of an industry where both developing countries and the developed countries benefit. The win-win situation kind of initiative that has happened for long. But I think developing countries are now realizing that there's no win-win. People die of this kind of recycling. The environment is contaminated and so on. I'm so happy that in France, I see a report that a mother and a daughter have filed a case against the government for air pollution, which has brought sickness to them. I think more and more people are realizing now that these kinds of developments are actually detrimental to human health and environment. And I see a lot of implication for such legal cases after the legal cases pronounce the judgment. For instance, the American case, that you all know that 3 people have won the cases in America against the use of glyphosate, which is a component of the Roundup pesticide, weed killer, in used by Monsanto in America and elsewhere. Now, that's the kind of positive development that is taking place, which means that more and more people are realizing that this is not an economic growth. This is not an economic activity that we should be proud of. And although the World Bank estimates maybe that 70% increase will take place, but I think more and more people standing up can push it back to the developed countries.
And do you think with this realization that this should go beyond just economics, it's about our sustainable futures, Do you think with that there will be more investment in alternatives in biodegradable material?
Well, that's a headache for those countries which actually produce that kind of a waste. A. B, yes, for developing countries also we need to focus on it, because let's say India, Pakistan, China and so on produce a whole lot of plastic waste within their own countries also, which also needs to be disposed of. So that's a headache for the developing countries to take care of. But I personally feel that allowing the rich countries to dump their wastage into, or their garbage into developing countries is something that must be stopped. And let those countries take care of their own garbage. We take care of our own garbage. I think that's the way forward. That's the sustainable way forward.
Right. With that, you're saying that it must be stopped. Mr. Andrew, what problems do you foresee in that when, on the political front, when countries start saying, no, we're not going to be taking your waste? Do you foresee any conflicts? I mean, the Philippines president went so far to say that they are willing to sever ties with Canada if they do not take back this waste. How do you think things will heat up?
Well, I think if you look at the example of outsourcing polluting industries in the past, don't forget the early industries which were being outsourced to China, mostly polluting. But why China accepted it? It's because China wasn't strong enough. The economy needed that kind of investment. So that if we apply this analogy to the current situation in relation to if we apply this analogy to the current situation in relation to some less developed countries, some country may say, well, all right, I'm too poor. I'm willing to accept $1 million US, and I'm willing to accept all this garbage. But that then really it depends on the negotiating strength. But I think that there is, as I said, it is a worldwide problem. And then it's not just about economics, it's about sustainability. If we pollute, for example, the waters and the soil of one country, that can spread to the neighbors, especially the water resources. If we pollute a tributary, I mean, some rivers run through different countries and it destroy the ecology in neighboring countries. So I think there's a great deal of incentive for regional cooperation, for international cooperation. If all the developing countries, as in the case of climate change, the Paris Agreement, unite together and also present a united front and to force the agenda to the United Nations so that a permanent solution can be found for the benefit of all.
Right. And you mentioned how this will provide an opportunity for greater regional cooperation and greater international cooperation. That is a very important point there. But just to divert a little from this and talk about the repatriation process of when this garbage will be sent off back to these countries, are there any dangers of that, spillage of that, waste being disposed harmfully into the environment while that process is taking place?
I think that the first point is that this is a very good, a very strong reaction from some developing countries. I think that the voice is now heard loud and clear. Now, as far as the developed countries exporting, the exporter of this garbage are concerned, being developed countries, there are internal safeguards. I mean, the population, the electorate would object, would in fact rise in protest if these countries, companies or the countries themselves dump them into the environment. I mean, the first objection that would be raised would be the people in these developing countries. So I don't think that there is such a risk, because being developed countries, there are certain various internal safeguards. But I think the problem remains. And as this garbage is returned, as I said, it's going to translate into a kind of, as this garbage is returned to the developed countries, it's going to translate into pressure on the developed countries themselves to address this issue in conjunction with the developing countries, ideally at the United Nations.
Right. And Sharma, we're hearing about how there is going to be more international pressure placed on these developed nations. But let's take a look at the developing nations themselves. Now, not all the garbage, not all the waste that exists in these regions is because of developed nations. But this situation does open the door for a larger debate. What regional cooperation is needed amongst developing nations to take control of this issue?
Well, I'm so glad that you say that there is a need for South-South cooperation, or there's a need for developing countries to come together and formulate a policy or formulate a kind of a collective position, as well as the way forward in tackling this garbage that is piling up within their own countries also. We can't allow the bigger developing countries to dump the produce into the smaller or the poorer developing countries. Now, if that's the kind of a trend which is also being seen greatly, that I find that the bigger countries or the bigger economies, developing economies, are also trying to do exactly what the rest of the world has been doing earlier, which is to dump their waste into other smaller countries or other poor or relatively poor countries. That is something that I think you are very right, that the South-South cooperation needs to formulate a policy stand on this, and which can be at the regional level itself. And there has to be a unified position on this, because I find now most of the wastage from the developing countries, the developing economies of the big developing countries, is now going to Africa. And I think which is worrisome. And to me, that's not the way forward. The world must reach a kind of a conclusion or an international understanding, and which, of course, the UN can play a very important role here, is to see that each country manages its own waste or own garbage, as you said earlier, in a way that it doesn't end up harming the way it used to do earlier.
And Mr. Sharma, just one last question to you. Mr. Andrews seemed optimistic about the future in the sense that this move of returning back the garbage will place much needed pressure on these countries. Do you share that optimism? Do you think that developed nations will finally own up to their own responsibilities?
Yes, I think that's the way forward. You know, I give you an example. In India, the Bayer company, the pesticide manufacturer, their containers are lying at the port, and the government says, please, they are leaking, and please carry them back. And they have said, oh, we don't have space to keep them back home. But that is not something which is desirable. I think the countries must put pressure that the garbage must be taken back by these companies, and that will send a very strong signal that these rich countries must learn to take care of their own garbage or on their own waste. I think that's very important. I'm glad Philippines has done it. I'm glad that many other countries have done it. But my worry is also that the lobbies are so strong. Let's look at asbestos. 60 countries have banned asbestos, but India and Pakistan both are lobbying that they are fine with Russia. So, imports coming in from Russia. So that kind of lobby, I think, must be stood up to, or people must stand up to that. And I think if 60 countries have banned it, India, Pakistan, and the other countries also need to ban it.
And on that note, thank you so much, Mr. Devinder Sharma, for joining us and talking to us. And thank you so much, Mr. Andrew Luing, for joining us and talking to us. We're now joined by Professor Dora Mironova, who's a professor of sustainability, joining us from Perth. Thank you so much, Professor, for joining us. Now, while we're talking about sustainable development, we know that the United Nations has created many sustainable goals. On the goal of maintaining pollution and making sure that our environment remains clean, how close do you think nations are to moving towards that goal? And we're comparing developed nations with developing nations here.
Well, the Sustainable Development Goals are goals that are supposed to be applicable across all countries, irrespective of their stage of development. We are now in a situation with quite a lot of environmental pollution, which is caused to the big extent by the developed world, and that relates to pollution in relation to greenhouse gases, as well as pollution which we are outsourcing to other countries such as China or Indonesia or Malaysia or the Philippines. So in many ways, the developed world is the one that is responsible for the current pollution situation that we have.
Yeah.
And because the developed world is the one responsible, the biggest role model of changes that can happen in this area should be with the developed world. So although the developed world is quite good at collecting some of the waste at source and trying to control the pollution, some of the decisions are not fair to other parts of the world, such as China and Indonesia.
Right.
So the responsibility rests very much with the developed world. But having said that, the developed world also has technologies and ways to handle this problem. So I see the biggest responsibility resting with the developed world.
So, Professor Marinova, you've correctly highlighted the main issue here, that outsourcing all this waste to developed nations and the responsibility, developing nations, and the responsibility lies with the developed nations to do something about it. But the fact is, just taking back this waste or stopping the exporting of this waste isn't enough. What about all the years that they were doing this? Do you think that there should be any accountability in terms of giving a fine or providing economic assistance to these countries to help them out for all the damage that was done?
Yes, I agree with you completely. And this is why the World Bank and the United Nations are trying to establish funds to support the developing countries to handle some of the problems that they're not responsible for. Having said that, I'm in Australia. Australia has not put enough of innovation and technological efforts to actually develop its own recycling industry. We have opted for the easy option to export pollution and export waste to other parts of the world. At the same time, Australia has the technological capabilities and skills to develop a domestic technology to handle this kind of problems. There are some interesting new developments. For example, in the area of innovation, we have something which is called a sea bin that is something like a vacuum cleaner and can suck out of the plastic pollutions from the ocean.
Right.
So we are creative and we have ways of solving these problems. However, we're just putting them as a low priority, while it should be something that is extremely important.
Right. And Professor Marinova, you see the example of your own country, Australia, that has been exported its pollution as opposed to taking control within its borders. Now, is this something that the people in Australia are aware of, or is this information only limited to policymakers?
People were not aware about this until China stopped accepting the plastics coming from Australia. People were also not aware until Indonesia started saying you are exporting paper for recycling, but the paper is actually contaminated with food debris. So now there is much more awareness compared to what it would have been probably 2 years ago. So to me, it's very important that the developed and the developing countries work in collaboration rather than blame one for the problems created by the others. So there is increasing awareness and people are trying to put the responsibilities on their local governments to find solutions that can handle the problems of pollution domestically rather than being exported.
Right. And thank you so much on that note, Professor Dora Marinova, for joining us and talking to us. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you next week with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.